Good morning, good afternoon to our participants in Europe, and welcome to the Atlantic Council's discussion of the European Health Data Space Regulation, a new regulation that has just been adopted 2 days ago by the European Parliament. My name is Ken Propp. I'm a senior fellow here at the Europe Centers at the Atlantic Council, and this event is part of our Digital Marketplace initiative. The Health Data Space Regulation is the latest in a series of expansive digital measures that have been adopted by the European Union in the last several years, including the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and also very recently, the Artificial Intelligence Act. The Health Data Space Regulation, however, is much less well known, at least in the United States. And today's panel is hopefully going to be a first step in remedying that situation. And to explain the EHDS to us and to put it in a transatlantic perspective, we are fortunate to have with us three very knowledgeable speakers. We have Ove Langveld of the Digital Health Unit from the European Commission's Director General for Health and Food Safety, known as DG Santé. Alex Greenstein from the U.S. Department of Commerce, who is the director of the Data Privacy Framework there, and Konstantin Jauch, Director of Partnerships at Merck, and who represents its joint venture, Syntropy Technologies. Each of them will be speaking initially for some minutes, after which we will take questions from our virtual audience. In order to ask a question, please go to askac.org and register your question that way, and then we'll take it from there. The Health Data Space Regulation is the first in a projected series of sectoral legislative measures creating data spaces in important sectors of the digital economy. And other envisaged ones include energy, finance, and transportation. So this is an important first measure. It has both consumer and business-facing aspects, which we will be hearing about from Ove. In addition, it aims to create a formal market for the secondary use of health data, where no such formal market currently exists. And then finally, a third aspect that we will be talking about today is its impact on the international movement of health data. This regulation requires that data be kept in Europe in certain circumstances, what's called localization, and it also places certain restrictions on transferring data outside the European Union, building on similar measures that have been contained in other EU data legislation, including the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR. And with that, I would like to turn to our first speaker, to Ove. Thank you for joining us from Brussels. Ove, what, in the view of the Commission, are the main benefits that this regulation will bring for individuals and companies? And could you explain to us a bit about how it builds on other EU legislation?
Yes, hello, Ken. Hello to the audience. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are from Brussels. And yes, happy to be here. Now, quickly to give a bit of an overview of where EHDS in a nutshell, what's it about, what's in it for patients, what's in it for researchers. We have, in a way, 3 or 2.5 main legs. We've got primary use, so use of data for the delivery of healthcare, where we are building on the data subject rights, such as access in the GDPR, in a sectoral way to give people easier access to and better control over their own health data, kind of patient-facing side. On the health professional-facing side, doctors will also have easier access to their patients' data, saving both them and the patients time and money. If, for example, it becomes easier to access test results that a patient has done recently instead of redoing a test. We are also, because obviously this is the European health data space, there's a big cross-border angle. So we're building up, again, on the primary use side, a cross-border infrastructure that would also allow these kinds of exchanges between the EU member states. So if you happen to be somebody affiliated to the healthcare system in, let's say, Italy, and while on vacation in another member state, you break a leg, the emergency services there would be able to pull up your patient summary and know the main relevant bits of your patient history from back home. So all of this would serve to ensure seamless exchanges for the continuity of healthcare. These kind of infrastructures build on a existing voluntary cooperation under the Cross-Border Healthcare Directive, but we're planning to scale this up to both more data that could be exchanged. And of course, when I said the old infrastructure was voluntary, now we plan to turn that into a mandatory system for the member states. That's the first leg. Second leg, what we call secondary use, so the use of data for research and other public interest purposes, such as policy making. There, the main aim of the proposal is to, let's say, open up these vast troves of health data that are kept by healthcare providers, by companies, etc., and so on, and make them available for these purposes, such as research. Now, how we're going to do that, we'll be creating an obligation to make anonymized or pseudonymized data available under defined conditions with a clear governance process and fair access conditions. That should enable both researchers to make use of the data that is there and have it opened up for research. It should also enable public sector users to use data in policy development for regulatory purposes, and so on. So in the longer run, this should then also feed back to benefits for the patients due to, well, new research leading to new medicines, new medical products, or also better, smarter, more evidence-based policy making. And the third leg, which takes a bit less prominence in the discussion so far, are certain requirements on EHR systems, so electronic health record systems, to make sure that they are interoperable and comply with certain logging requirements, which should then also help to have a starting point for creating an internal market for these systems in Europe. So that's kind of what EHDS is about in a nutshell. The second question Ken had was on how does this relate to some of the other acts that came out of the data strategy. So, or have been around before, as in the case of the GDPR. So on the Data Governance Act, which is about several things, but the main thing where we've got the link here are the rules it has about access to data held by certain public sector bodies. Now, the DGA is about if, big if, for example, if let down by legislation, national legislation, public sector bodies shall make certain data available. Here are some conditions on how you do that. So, for example, on fees, on the timelines for responding to requests, and a prohibition of exclusive arrangements. But it doesn't say you shall make data XYZ available. So that last part is the key difference, or the part where in the EHDS we go one step beyond, because there we do create an obligation on certain health data holders to make defined data categories available for the secondary use purpose. So that's the main difference there, or kind of the main part on the relationship. For the Data Act, which was adopted end of last year, there, that text again also is about several different things. The parts on data sharing there, so onward sharing of data of one of your devices, are there rather in a commercial perspective. So you have, for example, your car's telemetry data, and you want to share that not with your manufacturer, but the workshop of your choice, so that they can do certain predictive maintenance things on this. So it's a slightly different perspective. Then Data Act also has rules on emergency access to data by public sector authorities. And there it is kind of a last resort fallback option where there's no other legal basis that could provide such an access. Now, in the HGS, what we're doing is for these research purposes or other public interest purposes to provide such a legal basis. So that's how those interact there. And finally, for the GDPR, so General Data Protection Regulation, we're in the primary use leg of the EHDS, we're building on the data subject rights under the GDPR and creating, let's say, you could call it a super access right that is on the one hand limited to these priority categories, but should then be made available immediate through some kind of access portal without any fees, even in the case of repetitive requests. And independent, so like that. So that is a bit of a difference to the GDPR access rights, where the controller has up to a month to reply. And if you keep asking them again and again and again, they can also either charge you a fee for replying or refuse to act on the request. Here, because these would be supported by an IT infrastructure and basically be dealt with automatically, so without more human intervention, we do not have those constraints on it here. So that's that. It's a narrow right, but with more favorable conditions. Then in the secondary use angle, what we're doing is to provide the Article 9 GDPR safeguards for such use. So we have detailed rules on for what purposes data can be made available in secondary use, what are the safeguards, what you can and cannot do with the data, that they're only going to be made available in these secure processing environments, and so on. So that's how those interact. And finally, on the international aspects, I'm going to have kind of two on where to keep the data. If you're asking where they're coming from, look at the Parliament and the Council. It's opening positions for the negotiations. There was a clear call from both co-legislators to do something on this. And the outcome is that for these health data access bodies, which could orchestrate the access and secondary use, and some defined other actors, such as those who would provide those secure processing environments, if they happen, for example, a provider of a secure processing environment that happens to be established in a third country, such as the US, and they would, of course, then providing that service would entail a transfer of personal data under the GDPR. So they would need one of the transfer tools. And what the text says here is that only the transfer tool of adequacy decision is available to those. So if you have an SPE provider in the US, so a commercial company that provides these things as a service, and they are, under the DPF, they are fine. That's the one angle on international access. The other one is on data users of third countries or coming from third countries applying. And there we also had a clear call from the co-legislators to have some reciprocity requirements there. So there's a process by which we in the Commission will assess whether a third country gives similar access to EU-based researchers as we would need to give them. And if that is the case, then we can put them, let's say, on the list of people from the outside who can apply. That's one angle here. Then the other one is that both for primary and secondary use, I mentioned certain infrastructures that support the exchanges. There is, in both cases, a possibility for third countries to join them, which also goes together with a test on how their system works. Is it basically equivalent to ours? And if so, we again can put them on a list. They join the infrastructures, which in primary use would mean that they exchange the data like we would do among the EU member states. And in secondary use, it means that some of these supporting infrastructures would also be available for them. So we're talking things like federating the data catalogs that we make available. Sorry, I know I ran a bit over time here, but how to say, on each of those questions, I could talk for probably 3 hours at least. So I think 11 minutes, 12 is, no, I'm trying to keep this short. Thank you.
Thank you, Ove, for a heroic effort to compress this extremely complex and ambitious piece of legislation into a few minutes. Let me just ask you one brief follow-up question before we move on, and that is you mentioned that transfers of personal data to third countries that have adequacy decisions are possible. But most personal data in the world moves pursuant to contractual protections, so-called standard contract clauses. And that is not included in the legislation as a basis for transfers. I'm wondering if you could explain a bit what lies behind that legislative choice.
So maybe just to have one clarification, which is quite important. Those requirements in Article 60, well, A in the provision numbering of the text are for these health data access bodies, the providers of secure processing environments, who would be providing a service of this environment to health data access bodies, and the trusted data holders. So we are really here only talking about the case of these health data access bodies as public authorities and the certain service providers to them for providing an SPE. And there, what the call from the co-legislator is to ensure a particularly high level of protection. And the outcome of the negotiations there was that, okay, it is only then the adequacy decisions are available as a transfer tool. And the kind of reasoning behind that was, or how it came from the co-legislators, is that, and Alex knows this better than anyone else, when you have an adequacy decision, there is a whole process also looking at the legislation of that country on rules, for example, on governmental access to data, because that is one thing that a standard contractual clauses, which by definition are just contractual arrangements between the data exporter and importer, cannot address. So this is how then the legislator saw it fit that to ensure a really high level of protection for these, again, targeted situations, which are in the end kind of large amounts of very sensitive data, that for those the adequacy decision is, so to say, the gold standard among the transfer tools. So that is then how we ended up with this solution in the political agreement that was indeed voted on by Parliament earlier this week.
Thank you, Ove. Alex, let's turn to you now. in your role as superintending of the data privacy framework between the U.S. and the EU, this now becomes an important element in the health data transfer picture, as Ove has just described. I know the U.S. government was closely following this piece of legislation as it advanced through the process. How do you assess the final outcome of the legislation?
No, thanks for having me, Ken, and definitely glad to sort of be participating in this process. And we have been from the U.S. government, I think closely monitoring this legislation. Again, let me preface this by saying that sort of we're still working our way through the final articles of the European health data space legislation. But we definitely are sort of happy to see some, I think, significant improvements that address some of the concerns that were raised by sort of a number of actors, particularly around sort of international transfers. And just sort of stepping back, I mean, I think this is part of this sort of longer story that Ken, you and I and others and partners in Europe are familiar with of, bridging sort of the differences in sort of US and sort of European approaches to privacy and sort of recognition that sort of we generally share the same end goals, but we do need to sort of work to ensure that there is interoperability between our legislation and that there are sort of tools available to facilitate transfers of data and sort of participation of US and European companies in each other's markets. And that really does benefit sort of individuals, providing them choice and then also allowing sort of cooperation on health, which is a very important area to all of us. So yeah, we generally share the EU's goal of harnessing the benefits of trusted health data, and that can really help improve health outcomes, drug discovery and development and authorization and sale of medical products. And we think the European health data space is a significant step forward in advancing those goals. And yeah, we really do want to work with sort of the European Union and the Commission to support the transfer of health data flows and ensuring that it can happen in a trusted and secure manner to support all of those sort of goals. And there's significant issues there. I mean, we want to ensure that we allow so that US businesses can continue to provide critical digital health services to the European market and provide products to the EU market effectively and sort of in compliance with these with this new law. And I think that is something that we're prepared to work with the Commission on. So walking through sort of like the legislation, I think, we're happy to see sort of there were changes made to sort of harmonize, I think, some of the provisions, particularly the definitions with the GDPR and other pieces of legislation, because that was sort of one other concern we had was sort of that you could have differing requirements that would be difficult for companies to apply in practice. And I think that sort of harmonization there was quite helpful. We're also very glad to see, I guess it was Article 60 AA added into the final draft that provided for transfers to countries with adequacy decisions, such as the United States, which we received under the data privacy framework. And that will, I think, provide a lot of flexibility and the ability for like third country storage and data processing to happen in accordance with the European health data space. And also, we were happy to see sort of additional provisions regarding sort of protecting intellectual property rights and trade secrets, which address some of the concerns as well that have been raised about sort of how that would be built into sort of the regulation. The other piece that we are tracking quite closely is on secondary use of data. We definitely sort of appreciate the goal there and understand companies do rely on primary and secondary use of health data to develop products and services and sort of monitor the ongoing use of those products. And also it benefits the research community in terms of using that health data. we'll be very interested in working sort of with the commission as they sort of flesh out the process for, I think, with noted sort of a reciprocity type process around secondary use of data. We definitely sort of want to sort of understand what that's going to look like and yeah, engage with sort of our European partners on that. Broadly, I think that sort of this also has sort of significant impacts and importance for the data privacy framework, which I run. And we do have sort of companies in the healthcare and health data space who are participants. And I think this sort of will reinforce the importance of participating in the data privacy framework, as it would allow those companies to receive data transfers, including health data. And that's actually an area that we've targeted for sort of additional growth. We think the companies could be using this more moving forward. But I guess, yeah, those are sort of our general sort of like, initial read on sort of the legislation. We definitely sort of like, welcome sort of it's like, the progress that's been made on it, and look forward to working with sort of our partners in Europe to as they sort of operationalize this and ensure that sort of we can continue to sort of have transatlantic data flows in the health space.
Thank you, Alex. Just one brief follow-up question to you. You mentioned this as potentially reinforcing for the data privacy framework and changes that were made in the legislation and in the final stages in that direction. Do you have residual concerns about the localization provisions, the lack of transfers pursuant to standard contract clauses? Are these things that you think will be difficult in the transatlantic environment or not?
I mean, I think that certainly we do sort of like, have concerns about sort of the ability of like, companies to sort of like, yeah, data localization is sort of like an ongoing concern. As well as sort of like, yeah, ensuring that there are sort of consistent rules between the sort of the member states on this. And that sort of, I think, is something that we're also very much focused on. I guess I would say that sort of like in terms of like, the concerns around data localization, I think that's something we want to sort of have discussed with sort of the commission moving forward on this. And also we'll be looking to sort of see how that is applied in practice. So I think that's a lot is going to depend on that.
Okay. So implementation questions
yes,
to be determined here. Konstantin, thank you for waiting. I want to turn to you now. You work for an international health data company. I'm hoping you can explain a little bit the nature of your company's role in the market, and in particular, how it views the health data space regulation. Is it a significant measure to harmonize health data laws across the EU? And do you think its provisions will prove effective in creating a secondary market where data can be used? Over to you.
Thank you, Ken, for having me. And as you said, I'm representing a practitioner's view today, and I'd love to start, as you said, like maybe by explaining like who I'm working with, and this is actually Syntropy. I have a few slides prepared. Yes, now we're on the first one. Syntropy is a company, I'm explaining it in a second, with the goal of unlocking kind of the power and the potential of data in the healthcare industry. I think you've done the introduction, so I'm jumping over this. It's a software company, and we specialize in or offer software for data integration and secure collaboration, moreover in the healthcare space, and to fight against countless diseases. And this is a joint venture between two companies here. On the one side, Merck KGaA Darmstadt, Germany, so the European Merck that I'm working with mainly, and with Palantir Technologies. And this joint venture aims at combining the scientific expertise Merck has in healthcare and life science in particular, and also combine this with the unique technology that Palantir provides, and also their experience in data integration, data analytics, and of course, security and privacy. One thing I want to spend a second on is the problem I think we as a company trying to solve, and I also see, the European Health Data Space trying to solve, is that, there's a lot of valuable data in healthcare in particular. And this data is critical in order to, speed up science, speed up, treatment development and other pieces. However, this data is often trapped, in silos. It's not really exchanged, not really used, and this leads to huge inefficiencies. And I think inefficiencies is a tough word here because it's not only, economic inefficiencies, it's also like inefficiencies and the lack of prolonging lives, improving lives, and saving lives. So inefficiencies are at a high cost. And, as you can see here on the left-hand side, right, the data is for individual institutions is not easily available because a lot of times, they have their own data in silos and cannot access it. So we help institutions with that, getting access to their own data for research, but we also help, then consortia, nations, and, also then consortia out of nations to share the data. And on the right-hand side, I think this is also coming out of a lot of research, is that researchers on the one side, they really want to share data. They want to make it available. And a lot of times they lack kind of, the regulations in order to do this, the software to do this, or the tools to do it, and sometimes also the incentive to do it. And this is the same for citizens. I want to say, like, which is coming out of the European Health Data Space. Also, citizens want to provide their data for research or for the greater good. And I think this is key. This is also another problem, is that this motivation stays high if you can trust, the way it is shared, the approach, technology, everything behind it, and if people, hold these elements and these companies accountable. I think this is key. This is something we also want to provide, right? We now talking about our solution, as mentioned, we help health systems to integrate the data. We provide services for that and software for that. And then we also make it available for companies, consortia to work with each other to access it. Like you can put in a way also, you can talk about member states here, but also, across member states, and we're kind of an infrastructure for that. Key here is we don't own the data. We will never own the data. We just facilitate and we're not data controllers in a way, right? We just facilitate and these exchanges and help the companies to do so in a secure, transparent, and de-identified manner, or anonymized manner. The question you posed is a good one. How do we see regulations? I'm getting, more specific to answer your questions, but one slide here quickly is, our solutions are built. Our solution, our architecture, the whole applications, everything, our operations, our governance is really developed in order to comply with, most of the rigorous legal and regulatory requirements in the industry. Right, we can comply with GDPR, with HIPAA, and others here, and we're really looking forward to the implementation of the Health European Data Space. And this brings me, in a way, back to your question, like, what is kind of our perspective as practitioners on the European Health Data Space? And I want to say that, as a practitioner, and probably as a lot of data platforms, we welcome a harmonization of legislations and regulatory, in a way, because this allows this unified framework which is created allows us to reduce uncertainties, right? This framework provides certainty and reduces compliance burdens, like dealing with every individual legislation and all of these individual elements. And of course, it provides also potential for enhanced collaboration and data integration in the sector overall, while ensuring like, forcing everybody to ensure the safety of sensitive and personal data. Our company in particular has made, secure processing of sensitive data as core of our software, right? The same in line with data integration. This is the other core. And we have really a commitment to data protection, especially in the context of data sharing. It is precisely granular controls that are built into our software by design that enable users to share their data selectively, but also securely. And again, I'm really looking forward to the European Health Data Space as this, represents a significant step towards harmonizing data laws across the EU. While of course, I think Alex, you mentioned it, there are some challenges with like the nations, right? There are some cultural differences to data collection and data privacy. There are some differences in the state of technical infrastructure. I think that is also key and especially important for practitioners and implementation stakeholders. And this results, and this is on the other side probably of this regulation, this results in a lot of and significant investment in comprehensive compliance measures, but also infrastructure from the member states, but also platform providers. I think that is my take on kind of my perspective on the European health data space. But again, I'm really looking forward, and I think taking everybody with us, the member states, the practitioners, is key to achieve the goals of the European health data space and ensure the seamless data exchange.
Thank you, Konstantin. It's really interesting to hear how your company has designed technology around the new legislative framework that's just emerged in Europe, and also attempts to bridge to the United States and to other third countries where there are still some significant differences. The same question to you as I put to Alex. Do you, from your company's perspective, do you see the solution on international transfers of data as a workable one for third countries generally? Are there still challenges in this area with regard to the localization provisions and some of the transfer restrictions?
Yeah. The data localization is interesting. And I have, say it quickly also, I think data localization will evolve, or the regulation on data localization will continue to evolve. I believe for now, it creates a few obstacles, maybe, from an economic perspective, a few hurdles, as it is kind of a market entry barrier overall, like to foreign companies who could provide services in Europe. And, it's good for domestic companies on the other hand. So, we can discuss, probably also about competitiveness and innovation in the European market on that, but I don't want to go down that road. But staying on data localization, right, it has effect on research collaborations, right, involving EU member states and non-EU countries, right? It is also disrupting the ability of companies to combine data from different regions in the world to conduct global research. But I'd like, Owe talked about this. I think there are exceptions and there are ways, around that. Or not around that, sorry, around is not a good word, but there are ways to solve it and to make it work. And nevertheless, it is a hurdle because you have to go through extra steps, and it's not as smooth as easy as it should. Nevertheless, again, as I said, I fully believe that the data localization provisions will evolve and you probably change a bit in the future, and that ongoing, especially bilateral discussions on data flows between like EU and friendly countries such as the United States will provide us much further insights and learnings, about the requirements in the future. So I overall believe, right, there is a real chance in shaping the future here of health data and digital ecosystems also across the globe.
Thank you. I want to give our other speakers, Ove and Alex, a chance to react here to what's been said from the commercial perspective. Do you have any further thoughts to offer on that? Go ahead.
Yes, maybe just because indeed, people talk about data localization, sometimes in general terms, sometimes and specifically on what we now have as transfer requirements in the text, in the HDS text. And the additional transfer requirements on transfers, rather, to put it that way, that we have here are in a way very limited. It is about, for the health data access bodies themselves, so public sector bodies of EU member states, for certain trusted data holders that can be designated by them, which would also be entities over here on this side of the Atlantic. and particularly also then providers of secure processing environments. So for those, the transfer tools would be limited to adequacy decisions. But it is only limited to these kinds of actors and systems. So if you have a supplier of electronic health record systems, let's say patient management systems for hospitals, they are not in scope of that requirement under Article 60A. Neither are, let's say, two pharmaceutical companies doing a joint venture for developing new drugs, new medicines in their bilateral cooperation. So they're also out of scope of that requirement. It is really, really targeted to these secure processing environments and the processing by the health data access bodies. So it is in that sense, yes, really small. So I mean, for the different angles of Syntropy's business that Konstantin mentioned, I mean, yes, if you want to in the future offer secure processing environments as a service that the health data access policy of the EU member states could procure to have that you guys run those systems for them, that service would be in scope. But some of your other businesses like the information management systems for hospitals, that would be not in scope of that requirement. So you would be in that case under the normal GDPR transfer rules, including standard contractual clauses, should you and your customers choose to use that instrument. So just to say here that what is here on the additional rules in terms of transfers only with adequacy is really only targeted to those very specific situations.
Thank you. Alex.
No, let me start off by thanking OA for that, like, a very helpful clarification. And I think that sort of certainly this, like, legislation will be very closely read by legions of sort of data privacy compliance lawyers as they try to sort of navigate this. But sort of more broadly, I think it is very welcome to sort of include, to sort of clarify sort of like, that this was sort of narrowly targeted. And also, I mean, there was an effort to sort of include provisions there for, enabling sort of data transfers under, but I think certainly we'll have to see sort of like, how the sort of, I guess, that sort of the exception for that is sort of applied in practice and making sure that it isn't too onerous for sort of companies to be able to utilize that, because certainly I think, there is a great deal of interest and benefit in being able to sort of, transfer that data and being able to aggregate it with sort of other patient data. The larger data sets you have to work with, the more robust findings you can make sort of in terms of research, and that benefits all of us in terms of having greater scientific findings and more powerful findings for health. Also, I would say this type of transfer is something we did sort of also contemplate when we were negotiating the data privacy framework, and that we actually included in there explicitly coverage for key coded and clinical trial data. And I think that's been a sort of significant improvement of sort of the DPF over predecessor Privacy Shield. And that's definitely been something that sort of companies in sort of the health space have been, I think, pretty enthusiastic about being able to use the DPF to transfer that data for clinical trials. And sort of more broadly, I think that sort of like, the reference to adequacy is helpful in terms of sort of the overall sort of the broader sort of like, justifications for data localization. I mean, it's been mentioned concerns about government access to data. And I think that sort of the fact that the US issued sort of Executive Order 14086 that put in place significant additional protections for sort of European personal data transfers to the United States regarding sort of government access to data, and put in place sort of new limitations on access to data, and provided an unprecedented level of redress. I think the recognition of that as addressing sort of the concerns raised and really seeing the United States as sort of a trusted partner. I think that's very important. So that recognition of the GDPR, of the adequacy decision there. And also I think more broadly, I think it flows into sort of the broader discussion around sort of data free flow with trust. I mean, that we should be able to transfer this type of sensitive data to trusted partners who are like-minded democracies with assurance, because the benefits of sort of being able to transfer data are really important for European citizens, US citizens, and I think that's it's important to keep sight of that.
Thank you, Alex, for raising the point about government access, because there are provisions in this legislation, just as there are in the Data Act and the Data Governance Act, that address potential conflicts of law between government access requests and privacy, and that is an area where the data protection framework and the executive order that underlies it are important, but it's also an area I think that bears watching in the future, and not just for the United States, incidentally, but for other countries as well. At this point, I'd like to turn to audience questions. As I mentioned at the outset, please use askac.org if you have questions you want to submit. We have a couple that have come in, and I'm going to take them together. They deal with the degree of harmonization here among national laws. EU regulations are intended to have broad harmonizing effect, but sometimes they do leave areas open for member states to do additional measures. And one area is in Article 33, Paragraph 5 of the agreement, where it allows member states to impose stricter conditions on specific categories of data. So, for example, they could make opting into use of their data more difficult on a member state by member state basis. This goes back to the fact that the member states are responsible for administering the opt-out provision. So in this respect, do you see a potential concern about fragmentation among the member states, notwithstanding the overall broad ambitions of the regulation?
So indeed, as you mentioned, regulations directly particularly harmonizing rules, but indeed here, like also in some other texts, we do have some clauses that allow member states to, let's say, adjust a bit at the margins. And this is one of those, because you can imagine that, well, how to say, everybody agrees that health data are particularly sensitive, but due to historical cultural differences among the member states, there are some concerns that are, let's say, even more salient in some member states than in others. So that clause there provides some, call it, recognition of that, and leaves indeed some room there to, yes, adjust at the margins. Now, do we have concerns on fragmentation of this? Well, it is, of course, then not fully harmonizing, but what we also need to see here is the comparison to the status quo ante. Where are we coming from? We're coming from a situation where some member states have rules on secondary use and have set up systems. Some member states are not as advanced yet. There's quite a lot of difference. We've got from no system to develop systems, but then again, systems that are still different from one another. And what we're doing here is to, let's say, at least set a baseline of what data and how data should be made available. So while we're indeed admittedly not fully harmonizing everything, we're taking really a huge step forward. So that is what I would say about that.
Thank you. Konstantin, I'm wondering how that looks from your company's perspective. The potential variations that are allowed under the regulation, are those a significant complication going forward?
I think both to some extent, right? You have, as always said, different, the statuses of the technological infrastructure and the legal infrastructure in the individual member states. And this provides, of course, also an opportunity for companies in these countries or a company like ours to, first of all, help the member states to kind of update their system, but then also, of course, help them in other member states to work together. And I think so it is a hurdle in terms of speed and these pieces, but it is also an opportunity to really help the countries to upgrade their systems, their infrastructure, and their legislation.
Thank you for that. We have another question going back to the creation of the secondary market for health data use here. The legislation creates this model whereby holders of data are obliged to make it available, and then public health data access bodies can license it for use. Ove, could you explain a bit more how this is going to work? Because I think this is really one of the novel areas that goes beyond where practice exists, at least in the United States.
Yes, that is indeed a point that also in the European perspective is quite a big step. So to kind of walk you through the process, what would happen if, for a data holder, let's say a hospital healthcare system that would need to make data available. The first obligation that they have is to declare the data holdings to the health data access body, provide a description of the data, and that description would then be made available in a data catalog managed by the HTAPs, also federated on European level. And this data catalog is what researchers would be browsing, so to say, to see what kind of data are available, what they can get access to. Now, let's assume that they researchers find data sets that they want to have made available in secure processing environment. So they submit an application, and the text spells out what needs to be in that application, what are the allowed purposes, and so on. They submit that to the health data access body. Health data access body receives it, assesses it, and also reaches out to the data holder. When the permit is granted, the body basically tells the holder to make the data available. Now, the holder, of course, the extraction of the data that they do there generates some costs for them. We do have provisions in the text that, of course, this data access is not free. There are a possibility for the health data access bodies to charge fees linked to the costs of the procedure and the cost of making the data available. And there is a part of those fees in general is also related to the costs or can be related to the costs incurred by the health data holder in making the data available. So for extracting them from the system and pushing them over into the secure processing environments. And those costs are something that the health data holder can declare, and which, as part of the fees, can then be fed back to them. So there would be some reimbursement of the costs incurred by the holders for that. So that's how that angle would work. Yes, so that's kind of how it works from the holder perspective. One thing, Alex also mentioned the provisions on protection of intellectual property and trade secrets. If the data holdings are concerned or concern information that benefits of such protection, then as part the data holder would also declare that, and the health data access body can then, for example, impose additional conditions on the data used to safeguard that information, or in an ultima ratio, if it is not possible to ensure appropriate protection, also refuse the permit application for that. But that is, let's say, the general flow from the what the process looks like for a health data holder. Yeah, sorry, I didn't have that slide because that would have also taken longer then.
Thank you. We're coming up on the end of our time, and so I guess the final question is going to go to Konstantin. You mentioned quite carefully that your company does not own the data when your systems are being used here. So who is the controller of the data when it is within your platform? And maybe you could give us a concrete example here. I think that would help.
Yeah. So it stays with the data contributor. The ownership stays with the data contributor. At the end, we like to implement, to give you a concrete example, our solution with a hospital system or an academic medical center, and help them to harmonize the data, integrate the data into one instance which is belonging to them. They can control then who they want to work with. So let's say they want to work with another medical center or academic medical center to do a joint research project. And we also help the other medical center to integrate the data. And these two parties discuss what data they want to contribute to a joint project in a way. And we provide like a Dropbox or a SharePoint where they can exchange the data, but we also provide tooling on top of that in order to, ensure that it's de-identified, ensure that, who is working on the data, we have like various governance tools there in order to ensure who is working on the data, changing the data, and all of these pieces to really control what's happening with it, and also to ensure that it's not leaving the platform, that it can be trusted, that there's not that privacy or security breach, and these pieces. So again, we are not controlling the data or owning the data, but we are providing the infrastructure around in order to facilitate a collaboration. And this can be multiple parties. It doesn't need to be two. It can be way more parties, where then individual agreements are signed, and everybody then can access a joint, agreed on kind of shared data space.
Thank you for that. Well, we have reached the end of the hour. I hope this has been as illuminating a discussion to all of you as it has been to me. It's clear that Europe is moving into a new era with respect to health data, and it's one that has big implications commercially as well as in international relations. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Ove, Alex, and Konstantin, and also to all of you who have listened and contributed questions in this event. The Atlantic Council will be continuing our active series of events and publications on transatlantic digital policy. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.